For 9 years, a billionaire kept a secret hidden in the west wing of his mansion. His autistic son, who never left his room, never spoke, and was forgotten by the world. Doctors gave up, family ignored him. Until one day, a new housekeeper walked in, saw what no one else did, and slowly earned his trust. What happened next froze the billionaire in his tracks, because for the first time, his son stepped out, not because of therapy, but because someone finally listened. Before we continue with this story, don't forget to subscribe to the channel and like the video. Oh, and don't forget to comment below where you're watching us from. We love to know that. In a huge and very expensive mansion in Beverly Hills, Richard Caldwell began his morning just like he always did, in complete silence. He was a billionaire, known all over the country, always appearing on TV and in newspapers for his success in business. But inside his home, especially in the West Wing, there was a secret he didn't talk about. His 9-year-old son, Lucas, lived in that part of the house and hadn't left his bedroom for more than 3 years. Every staff member knew the rule: stay away from that area. They whispered and called it the quiet zone. Nobody played music, nobody vacuumed, and no one knocked on that door. Richard never spoke about Lucas at meetings, not even when asked about his family. The boy's door was always shut, the curtains were always closed, and the lights inside were always very dim. No one truly knew what was going on. Lucas spent every day in the same small space, never stepping outside his room. He didn't talk to anyone and didn't make eye contact when the door opened. He sat on the floor, sometimes under his bed with old pieces of paper and pencils. Most of the time, he drew quietly or rocked back and forth, making soft, humming sounds. He didn't like loud noises. Even the sound of footsteps outside in the hallway would make him flinch or cover his ears. His world was very small and controlled. His drawings were often just shapes, shadows, or simple houses. There were no people in them. He had no toys, no television, and no books. His food was delivered, but he barely ate. If someone spoke too loudly or turned on a light, he would freeze, like a statue trying to disappear. Everyone knew better than to disturb him, and no one was ever allowed inside unless it was his stepmother. Helen Caldwell, Richard's new wife, had been in Lucas's life for about 4 years. Every morning and every evening, she would visit his room without fail. She always entered without saying a word, stayed inside for a while, and then walked out smiling. Always with perfect hair and makeup, looking calm and gentle. To others, she would simply say, "Lucas is sensitive," and nothing more. Her tone was always pleasant, but distant. Nobody dared question her. Some of the housekeepers noticed she never brought anything into the room or took anything out, and they wondered what really happened in there. But they never asked. Helen's visits were always at the same time, and if anyone walked near the West Wing during those moments, she would give them a cold look that made them turn around. Lucas never smiled when she left, and he never called her name. In fact, he never made a sound while she was present. Lucas didn't cry and he didn't laugh. He didn't shout or speak out loud during the day. But at night, when the house was quiet and the lights were off, he would whisper to himself. He always said the same words, over and over again. "Be quiet. Don't move. She hears everything." His voice was shaky, like he was scared. Sometimes he said it while hiding under a blanket, and other times he mouthed it without making a sound. The security cameras outside his door never showed much movement. His room had thick curtains, so no light could get in, and the cameras didn't record audio. If anyone was watching, they'd think nothing was happening. But Lucas stayed alert, always listening. When the wooden floor creaked somewhere far down the hall, he would stop breathing and stay still. Every sound made him nervous. Even the soft click of a light switch or the wind hitting the windows made him curl up. The west wing of the mansion slowly became a place of fear for the staff. At first, a few tried to clean the hallway or dust the walls, but after some uncomfortable encounters with Helen, they stopped. One maid had once seen Lucas through the barely open door. He was sitting on the ground, surrounded by crumpled drawings. His hands were shaking. She didn't speak about it to anyone else. Rumors spread among the workers, but nobody had solid answers. Some said Lucas was just special. Others believed something was seriously wrong. The truth was, no one had ever heard him speak a full sentence. When new staff were hired, they were given simple instructions. Don't go near the West Wing. Stay out of the hallway. Avoid questions and pretend it doesn't exist. Richard Caldwell, the head of the house, supported that rule completely. To him, Lucas was not something to be shared with the public or even close business partners. In public, Richard spoke often about charity and education. He smiled for cameras and gave speeches about helping children, but he never once mentioned his own. He had photos of his wedding with Helen and of vacations in Europe, but none of Lucas. He didn't show any signs of sadness or shame. It was like his son didn't exist. Some journalists had asked about children, but Richard always changed the subject. "My family is private," he would say with a polite smile. Behind closed doors, it was like Lucas had been locked away from the world. Even at family parties, birthdays or holidays, his name was never spoken. The mansion remained quiet, especially on the west side. It was a silence that everyone respected, even if they didn't understand it. Still, inside that locked room, every single night, Lucas would mouth the same short sentence to himself, like a rule for survival. "Be quiet. Don't move. She hears everything." Her past job was at a small community center where she helped care for children with different needs, including some who didn't speak or had trouble with touch or sound. The job had been hard, but Isabel was patient. She didn't expect her next job to take her inside a billionaire's mansion. On her first day, she arrived early and dressed neatly. The house was huge, clean, and very quiet. A tall woman with perfect hair greeted her. "I'm Helen Caldwell," the woman said. Her voice was polite, but her eyes were cold. Isabel followed her through long hallways, learning where to dust and where to mop. As they walked, everything felt too quiet. Helen moved like someone in charge. She gave instructions without smiling. When they passed a locked door, she paused and said, "He doesn't like people. Don't bother." It had no nameplate, no decorations, nothing to show someone lived inside. Helen didn't say who he was, and Isabel noticed no one else mentioned him either. The staff just called that part of the house the West Wing. During her tour, they avoided going near it. When Isabel asked if someone lived there, Helen only said, "He stays in his room." That was it. No other answers. Later that evening, dinner was served in the main dining hall, but only Helen and Richard Caldwell ate there. The staff ate in the kitchen as usual. Isabel sat quietly, listening. The other workers mostly avoided conversation. Then, from somewhere down the hallway, she heard a quiet crying sound. It was soft, almost like a child. She looked toward the sound, but Helen passed by without reacting. No concern, no pause, just walking as if she didn't hear anything at all. The hallway outside the West Wing always felt different from the rest of the house. The lights were dimmer and the air was still. Isabel was told to clean only the baseboards and not to go near the door. That night, while she was on her knees dusting, her cloth brushed against something rough. She moved closer and noticed scratch marks around the bottom of the doorframe. Some were deep, others faded. They weren't random. They looked like someone had dragged their nails across the wood. Some were fresh, with splinters still sticking out. Her stomach felt tight as she realized these weren't old damage from furniture or accidents. They were done by hand. She touched one lightly, feeling how sharp the grooves were. Then she looked back at the closed door. It was completely silent. She wondered if the crying earlier had come from behind it. She didn't know the boy's name, but she remembered what Helen had said. Isabel stayed in front of the door a little longer. She looked around to make sure no one was nearby. The hallway was empty. The other staff were likely downstairs cleaning the kitchen or preparing for the next morning. Carefully, Isabel leaned closer to the door. She didn't knock. Instead, she pressed her lips near the wood and whispered, "You're not alone." Her voice was soft, almost like a secret. She waited, listening. At first, there was nothing. Then she thought she heard something faint, a quiet humming. It was so soft, she wasn't sure it was real, but it was there. Just a gentle sound, coming from the other side of the door. Isabel didn't say anything else. She stood slowly and walked away, still listening as the humming continued. It wasn't loud or cheerful, but it was a response. It meant someone was there. Someone had heard her. It was the first sound she'd heard from that room. Upstairs, in a private room filled with screens and expensive furniture, Helen sat in a high-backed chair. In her hands was a small cup of tea, steaming slightly. She watched a monitor showing the hallway. The cameras weren't obvious, but they were there, tiny ones hidden in corners, watching everything. She had seen Isabel walk near the door. She had seen her whisper. She had seen her pause when she found the scratches. Helen didn't move while watching the footage. She didn't seem surprised. She took a small sip from her cup and stared at the screen for a long time. Then she leaned back and placed the cup on the table beside her. Her face stayed calm, but her eyes narrowed. "She's going to be a problem," she said out loud, speaking only to herself. Her voice was quiet, but serious. She already knew that Isabel was different from the others who came before. That night, the mansion remained quiet, just like every other night. The hallways were empty, the lights dim, and the West Wing was untouched by anyone else. But now, something had changed. Isabel had spoken to the boy, not with a loud voice, not by opening the door, but by simply saying words no one had said in years. "You're not alone." And even if it was small, the boy had responded. From inside his dark room, past the locked door and through layers of fear, he had made a sound. It wasn't much, just a soft hum, but it meant something. For the first time, there was a connection. Isabel didn't know his name, and he didn't know hers, but something invisible had started. Upstairs, Helen knew it too. She had seen it with her own eyes. And while everyone else in the house ignored the boy, Isabel had stopped to listen. On her second week at the mansion, Isabel started leaving small paper cranes outside the locked door of the West Wing. She folded them carefully at night, using plain colored paper, and placed them on the floor in the morning with a few markers beside them. Blue, green, red, simple colors, nothing too bright. She didn't write notes or leave messages, just the cranes and markers. On the first day, they stayed untouched. On the second day, the markers were still there, but one crane had moved a little, like it had been nudged. On the third day, all the paper cranes were gone, and the markers had been taken inside. Isabel didn't say anything to the other staff. That evening, while she was dusting near the door, she heard something new. A quiet tapping sound. It was steady, like fingers against wood. She paused and listened. It wasn't random. Someone was trying to communicate. The tapping came in short bursts, stopping and starting again like a pattern. Isabel knelt near the door and placed her hand gently against it. She didn't speak right away. She just listened. A few minutes later, there was silence. Then, very faintly, a voice came through. It wasn't loud. It was almost a whisper. "Blue is safe," the voice said. Isabel felt her chest tighten. It was the boy. His voice was small and careful, as if afraid to speak. She leaned forward and said gently, "Then we'll start with Blue." She smiled to herself. It was the first real breakthrough since she started working there. But not everyone liked what was happening. That same day, Helen called Isabel into the sitting room. Her voice was sharp and her tone cold. "He's not a pet," Helen said firmly. "He stays in there for a reason. Don't forget your place." Isabel nodded, but her mind stayed focused on Lucas. Later that night, Long after the house was supposed to be quiet, Isabel was heading to the laundry room when she heard something from the hallway near Lucas's room. It wasn't the soft humming she had heard before. This time, it was sobbing. Slow, quiet, crying. She froze, trying to understand what she was hearing. As she moved closer, the crying stopped suddenly. Then she heard it. Click, click, click. It was the sound of footsteps being mimicked. Small, light sounds made with the mouth. Lucas was repeating the sound of high heels on the floor. Then silence again, then the quiet thud of someone hiding, maybe crawling under the bed. Isabel didn't open the door, she didn't speak, but she stayed close for a few minutes before returning to her room. That night she started a notebook. She wrote everything she had seen and heard. She knew this wasn't just sensitivity, it was fear. The next few days, Isabel paid close attention. She didn't change her routine, but she made mental notes of every little thing. Every time Helen walked near the West Wing, Lucas would go silent. Sometimes, through the thin door, Isabel could hear him stop breathing for a few seconds when Helen's voice echoed nearby. Once, he dropped something, a marker, maybe, and it rolled across the floor. He didn't move to get it. Isabel could hear his fingers trembling as he sat still, afraid to make a sound. It was clear now, the boy wasn't just shy or sensitive. He was scared, terrified even. Isabel spoke softly through the door sometimes, mentioning colors or stories about her old job. She never asked him questions. She didn't push. She just made it clear that someone was there, someone who didn't want to hurt him. She continued leaving drawings, and sometimes they were returned with little changes. One morning, she found a small drawing left outside the door. It was simple, a house with a blue roof and stick figure standing outside. The lines were shaky but careful. Next to the drawing was the blue marker. Isabel didn't touch it at first. She looked at it for a long time. Then she picked up the paper and gently tucked it into her notebook. She took a blank paper and drew a little stick figure waving. She added a smile and colored the shoes blue. Then she placed it back on the floor. That same day, Helen passed by and gave her a long, hard look. No words, just a stare. Isabel didn't break eye contact. Something was changing, and Helen could feel it. Isabel wasn't scared of her, not like the others. That night, as she passed by Lucas's door again, she whispered something she had been thinking about for days. "I believe you." She didn't expect a reply, but the humming came back, that soft, low hum that Lucas always made when he felt safe, or at least calmer. It wasn't cheerful, but it wasn't fearful either. It was the same humming she had heard the first time he responded. Isabel closed her eyes and stood still for a moment. Then she walked away slowly, not turning back. She didn't know what would happen next, but she knew something had started. A quiet connection, a crack in the wall that had been built around that boy for years. Upstairs, the cameras were likely watching, and she knew Helen might be listening, but Isabel no longer cared. She had seen the fear, the signs, and now the first response. Lucas was reaching out in the only way he could, and Isabel was ready to keep listening. On Sunday morning, Isabel walked quietly to the West Wing with a small box in her hands. Inside were small containers of finger paint, blue, green, purple, and red. Along with them, she placed a folded note on the floor that said, "Wanna try?" She didn't knock or say anything. She just set the box down gently and left. Hours passed. The hallway remained quiet, and nothing seemed different. But by evening, when Isabel returned to clean, she stopped in shock. Bright colors covered the walls near the door. There were handprints, swirls, and long lines of paint. It wasn't perfect or neat. It looked like a child had explored color for the first time. She smiled, but said nothing. The next day, a new image appeared, a small, simple bird in blue. Lucas never came out, never spoke. But every morning, a new picture was waiting. It was the first time the hallway felt alive. Each day after that, Isabel saw something new on the wall. One day, it was a door drawn in green with a small knob. Another day, it was a large purple face with no mouth. Each one was painted in silence, without a sound or warning. Lucas never opened the door, and Isabel never saw him leave the room, but somehow the drawings continued to appear. The housekeepers avoided the area, pretending nothing was there. Helen walked past the paintings without a word. Richard never came close to that hallway. But for Isabel, each picture was a step forward. She never erased anything. She brought wet cloths, but only to clean the floor. She wanted Lucas to know she saw his work and accepted it. The silence between them now had meaning. The boy was telling his story, little by little, in shapes and colors. Isabel never spoke about it to the others. She just kept watching. On the sixth day, something unexpected happened. Isabel was walking through the garden early in the morning, checking on the back steps, when she spotted movement near the driveway. At first, she thought it was one of the gardeners, but as she got closer, she realized it was Lucas. He was barefoot, standing near Richard's expensive black Mercedes. In his hands, he held the red paint. He was using his fingers to draw flowers on the car's side doors. Big, red, messy flowers, not angry, just bold. Isabel froze. It was the first time she had seen Lucas outside his room. He didn't notice her. He was focused, calm. She took a small step forward, not to stop him, just to get closer. But before she could say anything, the front door burst open. Richard stormed out, yelling, "What the hell is this?" he shouted. His voice was sharp and it startled everyone in the garden. Helen rushed out right after him. She didn't ask questions. She didn't look at Isabel. She went straight to Lucas and grabbed his arm hard. "Inside! Now!" she snapped. Lucas flinched but didn't resist. Isabel tried to step in, but Helen shoved her away with her free hand. "You've undone everything," she shouted. Her face was red with anger. "Everything!" Lucas was pulled inside, his feet dragging across the ground. Isabel stood frozen, unsure what to do. Richard didn't say anything to her. He looked at the car, then turned and walked away. The red paint was still dripping down the sides. No one cleaned it. Isabel felt a deep, cold silence fall over the entire property. The cheerful colors from the last few days suddenly felt like a memory. She went back inside, feeling helpless. That night, she walked past Lucas's room, but there were no new drawings. The hallway was completely quiet again. The next morning, the walls in the west wing were blank. Every drawing, every brush stroke had been wiped clean. Isabel stood still in front of the wall where the bird had been. Nothing remained, not even a trace of color. She checked the trash bins. The used paint containers were gone. The hallway smelled like disinfectant. Lucas's door was shut tight, and no sound came from inside. For 3 full days, Isabel didn't hear anything. No tapping, no humming, no whispering. Nothing. She left gentle notes by the door, no reply. On the second day, she left new paints. Nothing happened. On the third day, she sat outside the door for over an hour, just waiting. The silence hurt more than Helen's yelling. She knew something inside the boy had been shut down again. Fear had returned. All the progress they made had been erased in seconds. Isabel felt like she had failed him. On the 4th day, Isabel walked to Lucas's door with no hope. She wasn't carrying paint or paper. She just wanted to check, just in case. The door was still closed, the light still dim. But something small caught her eye. She bent down and lifted the doormat. Underneath it, folded neatly, was a single sheet of paper. She opened it slowly. It was a drawing. A stick-figure boy stood behind thick black lines, like prison bars. His hands were reaching out, but his face had no eyes, no mouth, just an empty oval. Isabel stared at it for a long time. Her eyes burned, but she didn't cry. She folded the paper back and held it close to her chest. Lucas hadn't stopped communicating. He had just gone quiet again. But the message was clear. He was trapped and he knew it. Isabel stood up, looked at the door and whispered, "I'm still here." He didn't greet her or ask questions. Instead, he slammed a manila folder down on the counter with force. The sound made everyone in the room freeze. "This is not your child," he said sharply. His voice was angry, his face tense. Isabel glanced down at the folder. It was her employment file, background, experience, even her emergency contacts. "You're a housekeeper. That's it." Helen entered the room seconds later. She was calm, smiling slightly. Her tone was softer but full of control. "You're causing regression," she said. "He was stable before you arrived." Isabel stayed silent for a moment, then answered, "He wasn't stable. He was afraid." "There's a difference." Richard stared at her without speaking. After a few more seconds of silence, they both turned and left. Isabel stood alone in the kitchen, more determined than ever not to stop. That night, Isabel waited until the house was quiet. The other staff were asleep, the halls were empty, and all the lights were dim. She reached into her bag and pulled out a small audio recorder. It was the size of a pen and easy to hide. She placed it on top of a bookshelf in the hallway near Lucas's door, where it couldn't be seen easily. She made sure it was turned on and recording. Then she went back to her room, acting like everything was normal. Around midnight, she crept out quietly to check the device. The red light blinked. It was still recording. She left it alone and returned at dawn. After retrieving it, she listened through headphones. Most of the recording was just quiet footsteps and soft house noises. But at 11:42 p.m., she heard something clear, Helen's voice, low and threatening. "Make another sound and I'll lock the door forever," she whispered. Isabel sat in shock for several minutes after hearing the recording. She played it again, just to be sure she had heard correctly. There was no mistake. It was Helen. No yelling, no slapping, but the message was full of threat. Her voice was sharp and cold. Isabel didn't waste time. She saved the file and sent it to her friend Amanda, a child psychologist she used to work with. She also took a photo of what she found under Lucas's door that same morning, a small drawing. In it, a towering figure with red eyes stood above a small boy curled into a ball. The bigger figure had long arms and sharp fingers. Amanda replied quickly, "This is psychological abuse. Keep collecting evidence, be careful, do not stop." Isabel felt both scared and validated. Someone else believed her now. She wasn't imagining things. Something was deeply wrong inside the Caldwell house, and she needed to act. Isabel decided to stop sleeping in her room. Instead, she grabbed a pillow and a blanket and moved into the hallway near Lucas's door. She set up a small chair and sat beside it each night, staying alert. The first night, nothing happened. The second night, Helen gave her a strange look, but said nothing. Isabel pretended she was just resting during a long shift. On the third night, Helen passed by again, walking slower than usual. She didn't speak, but her eyes paused on the recorder in Isabel's lap. Isabel didn't hide it. She just stared back. That night, there were no sounds from Lucas's room. No tapping, no humming, only silence. Isabel kept checking the door, hoping to see another drawing or a note, but nothing appeared. It was like Lucas had gone into hiding again. The pressure inside the house felt heavier. Everyone was walking quieter, speaking less. It wasn't just quiet, it was controlled. By the end of the week, Isabel hadn't heard a single sound from behind Lucas's door. The silence didn't feel like peace. It felt like fear. She wrote short notes and slid them under the door. "I'm still here. You're not alone. I believe you." But none were returned. Each morning she checked the doormat, the floor, the corners. No drawings, no colors. No signs of the boy who once covered the hallway with birds and faces. Isabel spoke with Amanda again, sending a second audio file where Helen told another maid to stop asking about that room. Amanda warned her again, "You're getting close to something serious. Don't do this alone. Someone needs to know." Isabel thought about calling the police or child services, but she knew Helen had power. She could make things disappear. For now, Isabel's job was to stay close, stay patient, and keep Lucas safe, even if he couldn't respond yet. That night, as she sat in the chair again, Isabel turned off the lights in the hallway. She sat completely still, eyes on the door. Her phone was in her pocket, the recorder in her hand. Nothing moved. The house stayed quiet, no humming, no clicking sounds. The silence was so thick it felt like it filled the air. Isabel leaned her head back and closed her eyes for just a second, but she didn't sleep. She was waiting for anything, a voice, a footstep, even a whisper, but nothing came. It was the kind of silence that hurt. The kind that screamed without sound. Isabel whispered softly, "It's okay now," even if she wasn't sure it was true. The recorder stayed on. She wouldn't stop collecting proof. And until the moment came to act, she would not leave that spot. The silence behind Lucas's door was still there, and now she knew exactly what it meant. Isabel sat outside Lucas's door for the second night in a row without hearing anything. No humming, no tapping, no drawings under the mat. It had been 36 full hours of silence. At first, she thought maybe he was just scared. But as time passed, worry turned to panic. Something was wrong. She knocked gently on the door again. No answer. The curtains were still drawn. She checked the hallway cameras, but the system had been disabled. Helen walked by later that morning and with a smile said, "He's finally resting. He needs this. Don't interfere." Isabel forced herself to smile back, then turned away, heart racing. Helen's words didn't feel like care. They felt like a warning. Isabel knew Lucas. Even his quiet meant something. But now, there was nothing. That kind of silence didn't feel peaceful. It felt like something had been taken. She made up her mind. She would find him. Today. Around noon, Isabel carried a rag and bucket toward the back of the house. She told another maid she'd be cleaning out the dry pantry, and no one questioned it. She opened the small pantry door, pretending to wipe the shelves, and scanned the corners. The area looked normal, but something felt off. Then behind a rolling rack of bottled water, she spotted a panel in the wall, slightly cracked. She pulled it gently. A narrow wooden door revealed stairs, leading down into darkness. Isabel took a flashlight from her apron and stepped down slowly, one step at a time, careful not to make noise. The smell grew stronger, mold, dust, and something else. At the bottom, she saw a small, cold basement. In the far corner, next to a pile of old blankets, Lucas sat curled into a ball, trembling. He had no shoes. A thin blanket barely covered him. His lip was bleeding. Isabel ran to him immediately. She knelt beside him, placing her hands gently on his shoulders. "Lucas," she whispered. He didn't speak. His eyes were open but unfocused. His body was cold and shaking. Isabel wrapped the blanket tighter around him, then carefully lifted him into her arms. He was much lighter than he should have been. Too thin, too fragile. As she carried him toward the stairs, he clutched her sleeve with weak fingers. Halfway up, she whispered, "It's okay. I've got you." But when she reached the top, Helen was waiting. She stood with her arms crossed, blocking the doorway. "You weren't supposed to find him," Helen said, not angry, just cold, almost proud. Isabel didn't reply. She held Lucas tighter and shoved her shoulder into Helen, pushing past. Helen stumbled backward, shocked, but said nothing. Isabel walked straight through the hallway toward Richard's office. This time she wouldn't be silent. This time someone would have to listen. Isabel stormed into Richard's office without knocking, Lucas still in her arms, shaking. Richard stood up from his desk, stunned. "What's going on?" he asked, eyes wide. Helen rushed in seconds later, her tone suddenly sweet and concerned. "She's inventing things again," Helen said quickly. "She's confused, maybe tired." Isabel ignored her. She rolled up Lucas's sleeve and showed Richard the bruises wrapped around his wrist. Purple, clearly finger marks. Richard's face changed, but not enough. This could be anything," he said slowly. "I need proof." Isabel couldn't believe what she was hearing. Proof? A bleeding child in her arms wasn't enough? She said nothing and turned to leave. Back in her room, she opened her drawer and pulled out a USB drive. Inside was a new video, footage from 2 days ago, secretly recorded audio of Helen's threats and Lucas's crying. She tucked it into her bag. If Richard needed proof, he'd get it. That night, Isabel locked her bedroom door for the first time. She placed a chair under the knob and checked the window twice. Her phone was charged. Her bag with the USB was hidden under the bed, beneath her cleaning uniforms. She didn't sleep. At 2:17 a.m., she heard slow footsteps outside her door, then a soft knock. She didn't answer. A few seconds later, the doorknob rattled. Someone was trying to open it. When it didn't budge, the footsteps moved away. Isabel waited another 10 minutes before standing up. She peeked through the peephole. No one was there. She sat back down and stared at the door. This wasn't a warning anymore. It was a fight. Helen had crossed a line and she wasn't hiding it. Isabel didn't know who would believe her, but she wasn't alone anymore. Lucas had no voice in this house, but Isabel had one. And now she had evidence too. Outside, the house remained quiet. No alarms, no footsteps, no voices. But inside Isabel's room, everything had changed. She didn't rest. She kept checking the time, listening for sounds, ready to move if she had to. Helen had shown her true side. Richard had shown hesitation. But now Isabel had Lucas, and Lucas had someone who cared. She took the USB out of the hiding spot again and held it in her hand. This small object could be the key to everything. It held Helen's words, her threats, the proof Richard claimed to need. Isabel didn't know what her next step would be, but she knew one thing for sure: she wouldn't back down. Tomorrow, she would make calls. She would send the file to more people if needed. No more secrets, no more silence. Helen had tried to control everything, but now the door was locked. Isabel's door. The war had begun, and she was ready. Breakfast had just begun. The staff moved quietly through the dining room, setting plates and pouring drinks. Richard sat at the head of the long table, glancing through his phone while sipping coffee. Helen was across from him, calm as always. Isabel stood by the wall, watching the hallway. Then Lucas entered. He walked slowly, one step at a time. He looked pale, tired, and weak. Richard glanced up and looked surprised to see him out of his room. Lucas reached the table, placed one hand on the chair, and then collapsed to the floor. Gasps filled the room. Isabel ran to him and knelt beside him. Lucas whispered through dry lips, "No more basement." The room went silent. Richard stared in confusion. Helen froze in place. Isabel stood up and reached into her pocket. "You need to hear this," she said firmly. Then she took out her phone and played the audio. Helen's voice filled the room. The recording played clearly. Helen's voice was cold and sharp. "Make another sound and I'll lock the door forever." Gasps followed. The staff looked around at each other, wide-eyed. Isabel didn't stop there. She opened a folder and spread photos on the table. Lucas's bruised wrists, his bleeding lip, drawings of cages and figures with red eyes. Then she played a short video, shaky but clear, showing the basement, the blanket on the floor, and Lucas curled into the corner. "This is what he's been living with," Isabel said. Helen stood up quickly, knocking over her chair. "Lies!" she screamed. "You're all being manipulated." She rushed toward Isabel, arms raised. But before she could reach her, 2 security guards stepped in and grabbed her by both arms. "Let me go," she yelled, twisting and shouting. Richard didn't move. He stared at the table, at the pictures, at the boy on the floor. His hands were shaking. One by one, the other staff members began to speak. First, Maria, the cook, stepped forward. "I saw her slap him once. I didn't say anything because I was afraid," she said. Then Charles, the older gardener, nodded. "I saw bruises too. I thought maybe he fell, but now I know better." Another maid told everyone that Helen had forbidden anyone from entering the West Wing. One said Helen would stand at Lucas's door and whisper threats for minutes at a time. As each person talked, Richard's face went pale. His body trembled. He looked lost. "Why didn't I see this?" he said quietly. "How did I not see it?" He looked at Helen, who was still yelling, trying to break free from the guards. Lucas slowly stood up, knees shaking. He pointed at Richard and shouted, "She said you'd throw me away." The entire house fell completely silent. Nobody moved, nobody spoke. Even Helen stopped shouting for a moment. Richard stood still. His face was blank. Then he sat down slowly in the nearest chair, eyes unfocused. The guards tightened their grip on Helen, and she started yelling again. Isabel stepped between Lucas and Helen, protecting him with her body. Lucas clung to her leg, his breathing unsteady. A few moments later, 2 police officers entered the room. They had been called by one of the staff members who had left during the chaos. Helen tried to talk her way out, still pretending to be calm. "There's been a misunderstanding," she said, smiling tightly, but no one believed her anymore. Isabel handed the officers the USB drive with the recordings and the photos. They listened. Then, without hesitation, they placed Helen in handcuffs. "You can't do this!" she screamed as she was walked out of the house. Richard didn't stop them. He just sat in his chair, crying silently. Isabel held Lucas's hand and led him away. That night the house was quiet, but not in the usual cold, heavy way. The silence felt different. Helen was gone. No more closed doors, no more whispered threats, no more fear echoing through the halls. Isabel cleaned Lucas's room and helped him into clean clothes. She opened the windows and let fresh air in. Lucas sat on the bed, eyes still tired but calmer than before. Isabel pulled a blanket over him and sat down in the chair beside the bed. After a few minutes, Lucas pointed at the chair and said softly, "Here." She understood. She lay down beside him, fully dressed, just to help him feel safe. The door remained wide open. For the first time in years, Lucas wasn't locked in. Richard didn't leave his study. He had been crying there for hours. The mansion wasn't quiet because of fear anymore. It was quiet because something dark had finally been removed. As the night went on, rain began to fall outside. It tapped gently against the windows of Lucas's room. Isabel remained beside him, her eyes closed, but her hand resting on his. She didn't plan to sleep deeply. She just wanted him to know she was there. Lucas turned slightly under the blanket and whispered, "I told the truth." His voice was shaky, but there was pride in it too. Isabel opened her eyes and looked at him. She placed her hand on his shoulder and said, "And now the world will hear you too." Lucas nodded and closed his eyes again. For the first time, he didn't mumble to himself or flinch at hallway sounds. He simply rested. Isabel stayed beside him until morning. The house outside his room was different now. The silence no longer meant danger. It meant safety. Lucas had spoken, and this time, someone had listened. Helen didn't stay silent for long. Within a week of her arrest, she hired a group of expensive lawyers. News broke that she was claiming mental instability, stating that years of stress and medication had caused confusion and emotional outbursts. "She needs help, not punishment," her lawyers said to the press. Richard, under pressure, released a short statement. "The family is going through a private matter and asks for understanding." There was no apology, no name mentioned, and no direct support for Lucas. Isabel read it twice and felt sick. She had expected more. She had expected truth. The media, however, didn't stay quiet. Reporters gathered outside the mansion's gates, cameras flashing every time a staff member stepped outside. Photos of Isabel leaked online. Her face was shown alongside headlines like "Housekeeper or Hero" or "Caldwell Scandal Deepens." She hated the attention. All she wanted was for people to focus on Lucas, not her. Then the legal process began. Isabel was called to attend an official inquiry, led by court representatives and child protection officials. She was asked detailed questions about her time at the mansion, her relationship with Lucas, and the night of the basement discovery. She showed them the USB, the photos, and the drawings. They listened, but their tone was cautious. "We're reviewing everything," they said. Meanwhile, Lucas was scheduled to meet a court psychologist. A friendly woman tried to speak with him, but he didn't say a word. He stared at the wall, clutching a crumpled piece of paper in his hands. "He's too scared," Isabel explained, but they wrote in their notes, "non-verbal, maybe resisting." That night, Isabel found Lucas hiding again, this time inside the closet of his now safe room. "They don't believe me," he whispered. Isabel knelt beside him, hugged him gently, and replied, "They will, I promise you. I won't stop until they do." He didn't speak to the media. He didn't speak to lawyers. He didn't even speak to Isabel. But one night she saw him sitting at the security console, watching old surveillance footage. He looked tired, like he hadn't slept in days. He rewound hours of video, weeks even. It was all there. Footage no one had reviewed before. He saw Helen yelling at Lucas near the stairs. He saw her grabbing his arm hard and pulling him down the hall. He saw Lucas freeze when her shadow appeared. One clip showed Helen standing at Lucas's door, whispering something, and Lucas curling up against the wall. Richard paused the video. He sat still for a long time, then hit play again. When it was done, he leaned back in his chair, pressed both hands to his face, and started crying. The next morning, Richard asked Isabel to meet him in the garden. He didn't bring lawyers or security, just a folder in his hands. "I watched the footage," he said quietly. Isabel didn't respond. "I knew things were wrong," he continued, "but I didn't want to see it. I looked away. I enabled this." He handed her the folder. It contained printed stills from the videos, screenshots of Helen's behavior. "But I won't anymore." That afternoon, Richard personally delivered the footage to the police. Not through assistants, not through emails. He walked in himself and handed everything over. The authorities began moving faster. More charges were prepared. The court psychologist returned, this time more understanding, more gentle with Lucas. Still, Lucas didn't speak. But he watched everyone more closely now. He looked at their faces, their hands, their shoes. He was learning who was safe, and for the first time, he didn't run when people approached. That evening, the household sat down for dinner, just like always. But this time, something was different. Lucas was there, seated quietly at the main table between Isabel and Richard. The dining room had been adjusted, lights softer, no music, no loud clattering. Staff moved slowly and respectfully. No one stared at Lucas. He looked around the room, unsure but curious. Isabel helped him with his plate, cutting the food into smaller pieces, just how he liked. Richard didn't speak much. He waited, watched, gave Lucas space. The boy ate slowly. Bit by bit, he finished his meal without interruption. When dessert was served, he didn't touch it. Instead, he turned toward Richard, who had stayed silent the whole time. Lucas stared at him for a few seconds, then said in a quiet but clear voice, "Thank you for seeing me now." Richard blinked fast, surprised. He nodded. "You're welcome, son," he whispered back. The dining room stayed quiet after that. Nobody clapped, nobody cried. Everyone just kept sitting there, still, letting the moment happen. Isabel smiled softly, watching Lucas return to his food. Richard stayed seated long after dinner ended, looking at his son like he was seeing him for the first time. When Lucas got up to leave, he didn't look afraid. He didn't hide behind Isabel. He walked beside her, slow but steady. Upstairs, the bedroom door stayed open again. Lucas picked out a fresh pair of pajamas and laid them on the bed himself. He brushed his teeth with help. He even picked up his favorite marker, blue, and left it on his nightstand. That night, he didn't sleep in the closet. He got under the covers, and Isabel sat by his side. He whispered one more sentence. "I'm not scared right now." Isabel leaned closer. "You don't have to be," she said, and he believed her. The courtroom was full by the time Helen Caldwell entered. Her face looked calm, her clothes perfectly pressed, and her posture confident. Cameras flashed outside. Journalists sat in the back rows taking notes. Lawyers filled the front seats. On one side, Richard sat alone. On the other side, Isabel sat beside Lucas, who was holding a small blue marker in his hand. He wasn't drawing, just holding it. A therapist sat behind him for support. The judge entered and everyone stood. The trial began. Helen's defense claimed stress, mental fatigue, and false accusations. She spoke clearly, saying, "I only ever tried to help him." But Isabel didn't stay quiet. She presented the audio recordings, Helen's voice whispering threats. Then came the photos of bruises, the basement, and the scratch marks. Isabel read notes from other staff members who had been too scared to speak before. The room grew heavy with silence as evidence kept coming. Then the court asked if Lucas wanted to speak. Isabel looked at him gently. The therapist nodded, signaling that it was okay to try. Lucas stood slowly. His legs were shaky, but he didn't back down. The judge asked softly, "Do you want to say anything?" Lucas looked at Helen for just a second, then turned toward the judge. In a quiet voice, he said, "She made me afraid of doors." That was all, just one sentence. But it was enough. No one moved, no one spoke. Even Helen's lawyers looked down. The weight of the words sank into everyone sitting in that courtroom. Doors had become symbols of fear to a child. Not monsters or nightmares, just doors. The judge asked no further questions. Lucas returned to his seat and squeezed Isabel's hand. The trial continued for 2 more hours, but the mood had shifted completely. The courtroom wasn't just hearing evidence now. They were feeling it. After 2 more days of testimony and review, the judge returned with the verdict: guilty on all charges. Helen Caldwell was convicted of child abuse and psychological torture. The sentence was clear: 11 years in prison, no early release. As the gavel struck the bench, Helen's face finally changed. She didn't cry, but her eyes dropped. Her expression cracked. She was led away in handcuffs without speaking. Richard stood as she passed him, but she didn't look at him. Outside the courthouse, reporters asked questions, but no one answered. Later that day, Richard gave a statement to the press. He admitted his failure to protect his son and announced that he was stepping down from his position as CEO. He also pledged $25 million to national autism support programs. His voice shook during the announcement. "I failed," he said, "but I will spend the rest of my life helping others like Lucas." Cameras clicked, but no one clapped. A week later, Isabel sat with Lucas inside a courtroom office. A judge smiled gently at them and said, "Congratulations, Ms. Moore. You've been granted full guardianship of Lucas Caldwell." It was official. Isabel signed the final documents and turned to Lucas. He smiled, a real, calm smile, no fear in his eyes. They left the courthouse and headed home in a quiet car ride. The city passed by outside the windows. On the way, they took a route that led them close to the old mansion. It stood behind tall gates, as cold and silent as ever. Lucas looked out the window. He stared at it for just a few seconds. Then he turned his head away. "Can we plant something instead?" he asked. Isabel nodded. "Of course," she said. The car kept moving. That old house with all its secrets was now part of the past. Lucas was choosing something new, something alive. Later that afternoon, they stood in the backyard of their small home. The air was warm. Birds moved through the trees. Isabel handed Lucas a small shovel. "Wherever you want," she said. He picked a spot near the back fence, beside a small patch of soil. Slowly, carefully, he dug a small hole. Then he reached into his pocket and pulled out a folded piece of paper. He unfolded it one last time. It was a drawing of a black door, tall and wide, with thick lines. He looked at it for a moment, then placed it into the hole. He covered it with dirt, pressing the ground down with his hands. "Goodbye," he said softly. Isabel knelt beside him. "You'll never be behind one again," she whispered. Lucas looked up at her and nodded. Then he stood up and walked inside. For him, the drawing wasn't just paper, it was a memory, and now it was buried. The next day, Lucas asked Isabel if they could plant a real tree where the drawing had been buried. "A small one," he said, "but something that grows." Isabel smiled and took him to a garden shop, where he picked a sapling, a young cherry blossom. They brought it home and planted it in the same spot. As the roots were placed into the dirt, Lucas whispered, "This one is mine." Isabel stood beside him, placing her hand on his back. They watered it together. Days passed, and the backyard became a place where Lucas liked to sit, draw, or just rest. The fear he once held in his body began to fade. His drawings changed too. No more dark doors, no more red eyes. Now there were trees, blue skies, and people holding hands. He wasn't just healing, he was changing, and with Isabel beside him, every day felt safer than the one before. 6 months had passed since the trial. Life for Isabel and Lucas had changed in many ways. They lived in a smaller house now. No gates, no staff, just a quiet neighborhood with open yards and kind neighbors. Isabel had left behind her job at the mansion and was now working part-time at a local autism resource center. Lucas was attending weekly therapy, joining small group activities, and slowly building trust with the world around him. One afternoon, Isabel came home with flyers in her hand. "What do you think about helping me with something big?" she asked. Together, they started planning a community mural project. The idea was simple: invite children on the autism spectrum to come paint, express themselves, and feel seen. Lucas didn't answer right away, but later that night he brought Isabel a sketch, a figure breaking through a wall, flying into a yellow sky. Isabel knew that was a yes. On the day of the event, the empty wall on the side of the local community center became a canvas. Buckets of paint, boxes of brushes, and trays of markers were spread out across the ground. Parents and kids began arriving. Some children were nonverbal, others wore headphones, and some stayed close to their parents. Isabel greeted each one with patience and a smile. Lucas stayed quiet, but watched everything. When it was his turn, he picked blue and black paint. He started at the bottom corner and worked slowly. His section showed a boy standing next to a large, cracked wall, arms raised. The top part showed him flying into a bright yellow sky. The sky took up most of the space. No doors, no locks, just open space. Other children painted beside him. Animals, names, flowers, stars. It didn't need to be perfect. It just needed to be theirs. Everyone was free to create. Later that afternoon, a familiar car pulled into the parking lot. Richard stepped out quietly. He wasn't wearing a suit, just jeans and a plain shirt. He walked toward the mural slowly, carrying a small bag with a paintbrush and gloves. Isabel saw him and gave a polite nod. Lucas turned, saw his father, and paused. Richard didn't speak. He picked a spot next to Lucas and knelt down. "May I?" he asked. Lucas looked at him for a few seconds, then handed him the yellow paint. Richard dipped his brush and began painting tall sunflowers next to the yellow sky. He didn't try to talk too much. He just painted beside his son. When the mural was finished, Isabel added the final touch. Black letters across the top. I was never broken, just unheard. Some parents teared up, a few clapped. Lucas stepped back and looked at the full wall. His smile was small, but real. That evening, back at home, Isabel and Lucas set up a small picnic in the backyard. They laid out a blanket, a basket of food, and a small container filled with cupcakes they had baked together the day before. Chocolate with blue icing, Lucas's idea. They sat under the open sky. The stars weren't too visible at first, but as the night grew darker, more appeared. Isabel handed Lucas a cupcake. "For the artist of the day," she said. Lucas took a bite and nodded. No big words, just calm. The house behind them glowed with soft yellow lights from the kitchen. After dinner, they brought out flashlights and made silly shadows on the wall. Lucas laughed, not loud, but with ease. Isabel noticed how different his face looked now. Relaxed, peaceful. That kind of peace had taken months to grow, and now it was normal. No more locks, no more hiding. Just home, just safety. When it was time for bed, Lucas walked up the stairs on his own. Isabel followed, but he didn't ask her to stay. His bedroom had changed. The walls were light blue, his favorite. The shelves were filled with books, toys, and markers. But one thing was new, glow-in-the-dark stickers on the ceiling. That night, Lucas used a flashlight to draw extra stars up there with removable paint. When Isabel came in to say goodnight, he pointed at the stars. "I made these," he said. Then he walked over to the window and pushed it open. The night breeze came in gently. Lucas stood there for a few seconds, then turned around. "I want it open tonight," he said. "Blue is safe now." Isabel walked over, kissed his forehead, and sat on the edge of the bed. "Because now," she said, "you choose when the door opens. And when it doesn't." Lucas nodded once, then lay down. The room stayed quiet, but not in a heavy way, not like before. Lucas pulled the blanket up to his chest, his flashlight resting beside him. Isabel turned off the light, but left the door open, just like he liked it now. As she walked out, she paused at the hallway entrance and looked back. Lucas was staring at the ceiling stars. He looked peaceful. For the first time in years, sleep didn't feel like something to fear. It felt like something to rest in. Downstairs, Isabel made tea and sat by the window. The mural, the voices of other children, Lucas's painting, all of it stayed fresh in her mind. What had once been silence and isolation had now become expression and choice. Lucas had chosen blue. He had chosen to speak. He had chosen the window open. And most importantly, he had chosen freedom. And for Lucas, that door would never close again. Finally, we've reached the end of this story. I'm extremely happy that you've made it this far. Thank you very much for watching. Comment below what you thought and what was the best or worst part. Don't forget to subscribe. Until next time.